Today we're going to go deep on the subject of listening. But before we do that, I'm going to tell you something that's going to make you feel a whole lot better about your listening skill level. About 7 years ago, I was playing the guitar, heavily immersed in guitar playing in my music studio, and the cell phone rang. So I picked up the cell phone, and it was my wife, and she said, "Did you remember to pull the roast out of the oven?" And I said, "What roast?" And she said, "The roast I told you about 15 minutes ago, right before I left the house. I stood in front of you for about 3 minutes, and as you were nodding your head, I told you directions to pull the roast out of the oven." And so I panicked and felt really bad, because my wife had actually stood in front of me for 3 minutes telling me about the roast, and I had this vague awareness that she was there, but when push came to shove, I wasn't really paying attention to her at all. So I felt bad. I was thinking about escape routes as she was talking to me. They were clearly all closed off. So I apologized. I pulled the roast out of the oven. And then I had this thought that I felt bad because I was actually paying more attention to the cell phone than I was to my spouse. So I realized that this was an epic failure for someone who studied mindfulness in graduate school and has been practicing meditation and mindfulness for about 35 years. It's interesting because as coaches, we all know that listening is a really important skill. We know that it helps develop trust and rapport with clients. It's critical to the coaching relationship. We also know that it helps us have clarity and real understanding about what a client's situation is. So we all know we should develop it, but actually data reveals that most people are not good listeners. And my epic failure is a classic example that we're probably not as good listeners as we think we are. In fact, one researcher notes that probably 1 in 4 CEOs has a listening deficit. So here's another story to further illuminate this. There's a fitness writer that I really like. His name is Daniel Duane, and he tells a story about his quest to get strong and his failure and the epiphany that he had going to a special gym in Wyoming. And the story goes like this. He was working out with really fancy exotic equipment. He had engaged a personal trainer, and after all of this effort and years, he wasn't really getting any stronger. So in search of a story, and also in search of the quest for real strength, he went to this elite gym in Wyoming that's actually known for getting mountain athletes really strong. So he goes to the gym, and the gym owner there, Rob Shaw, gives him a 15-minute test. And within 15 minutes, it's determined that not only is Daniel Duane weak, but he's the weakest person there out of men and women from all age groups. And what Rob Shaw told Daniel Duane is that he had completely skipped over the basic skills that he needed to build strength, and that he had to go back to basics. And he had to think about eating right and really basic strength exercises. So I like this story because I think it's really representative of what can happen to us in a situation where there's an important activity that we're invested in, like coaching, and a really basic skill that's needed to develop that activity, like listening. And the interesting thing to me is two things in this case. Daniel Duane is a sports writer, and he knows a lot about strength, but he couldn't figure out what it was that he needed to do to develop real strength. And the second thing is that it's just a very basic skill. So how is it, knowing that most people are not good listeners, and that most coaches struggle with listening, and also understanding that it's a very basic skill that we need, a foundational skill that we need for coaching prowess, how is it that some of us might not give it the attention that it deserves or the attention that it needs? Well, it could be that, like Daniel, we follow a particular path with respect to listening skill, and we think we're getting better, but we're actually not. Another explanation could be that some of us are naturally gifted as listeners, and we get to a plateau, And when we get to the plateau, we realize that it's a whole lot harder and requires more effort and more intentionality to get better. And we're not used to that. And there's another reason that a Harvard study in 2016 points out, and that is that, like we all think we're great drivers, many of us actually think, most of us actually think, that we're good listeners, and we're not. So, whatever the reason, coaches are exposed to listening. Listening is not something new for coaches. We all know that we have to do it. We all know that it's important. So, what I'd like to talk about for the next few minutes is a couple of really basic skills that will help us with listening. And these are foundational skills. These are not fancy, exotic gym equipment. These are basic skills and basic ideas that will help us with listening. The first idea is really simple. And that's that listening, in fact, is a skill, and we should treat it like a skill. And the second idea is that listening has a strong convergence with mindfulness. And that convergence means that if we cultivate mindfulness, it will be foundational to our listening. So let's explore the first one, that listening is actually a skill and we should treat it like a skill. What does that mean? Well, skills can be acquired. And that means that you actually have to put in practice time, and that repeating something over and over again, whatever it is a good way to actually get better. Find a way of practicing and then do that thing over and over again. So also linked to this idea is that it's okay to have the theory. If you want to be a great musician, it's important to know music theory at some point, but if you never play, you're not going to get great. So you have to play. So you have to listen, and you have to do things that go beyond listening ideas or listening theory in order to get good. The second idea is that listening, if you want to get to mastery, is going to require a lot of work. Think 10,000 Hours by Malcolm Gladwell. And if someone tells you that you can become a great listener with just a little trick and without any serious practice, they're making you a promise in the dark. The third idea, and I think this is one of the most important, is that listening practice can be subject, as a skill, it can be subject to what I would refer to as the tyranny of self-oversight. And here's what I mean by that. With listening, you have this great opportunity because we listen all the time. It happens in every social context. And you can argue that if you listen well, it's not just great for coaching, it's great for everything. But if you practice listening and you do it in specific contexts, you have to do it with the right kind of effort. In meditation, we know that when you try to focus on your breathing, it's not really about clearing your mind. It's about letting the distraction come up, recognizing the distraction, allowing the distraction, maybe investigating the distraction briefly, and then returning gently to your breathing without focus. If you ask yourself, am I focused? Am I focused on my breathing? Am I focused on my breathing? That actually defeats the purpose of meditation. You can't possibly be focused on your breathing if you're asking yourself that question. So if you're listening and you ask yourself, am I listening well? Am I listening well? You'll actually have difficulty listening. So to summarize, we can practice it endlessly, but we have to treat it as something that needs to be mastered, so it's going to require hours, not just tricks. And it also requires us to avoid the tyranny of self-oversight, asking yourself all the time, am I listening? Am I listening? Am I listening well? Broad awareness is more appropriate without judgment. And that's a good segue into the next thing, which is that listening can be really enhanced by cultivating mindfulness. Mindfulness outcomes have a really strong correlation with the skills that are needed for listening. Let's provide a definition of mindfulness first, though. Mindfulness, and this is a pretty standard definition, is the non-judgmental awareness of internal and external experience in the present moment, characterized by openness, clarity, and acceptance. with that definition of mindfulness, we actually can see that it's pretty hard to be a great listener without having mindfulness. So there are 4 points here, really important 4 points. The first is the return to focus. There's a cycle that happens when we meditate, and it's the same cycle that happens when we listen. When we listen, often what happens is we start composing a response to the person we're listening to in our brains, or we get distracted. Those are 2 common distractions. The cycle is you try to focus, you get distracted, and then you gently return to focus without judgment. Meditation gets you familiar with that cycle. And that's the same cycle that happens when you're listening to someone. And if you do it over and over again, you meditate and you practice returning over and over again, you actually get better at it. The second important facet of mindfulness is that it creates a space. And the space is an open space with non-judgment. Listening is really about observation and not forming premature judgments. Even active listening is about that. So what we really want is to create a space for our clients where they can feel vulnerable, where they can open up, where they feel secure, and all that is facilitated by creating a non-judgmental space. Meditation is all about that. The third thing that we get from meditation is the idea of slowing down. The fourth mindfulness outcome that's very helpful for listening is the idea of detecting our own emotional biases and filters. When we're listening, those filters don't actually quiet down, they ramp up. And if they go unchecked, they can create cognitive dissonance in us, and they can reduce our receptivity. And so what we really want with clients is the ability to think about what their issues are and to hear what their issues are without being polluted by our own internal environment. So mindfulness and mindfulness outcomes and listening skills actually have a really strong convergence. If you've never tried mindfulness through meditation, give it a practice and watch what happens. Or even better, listen.